Do you remember the TV show Mission Impossible? The show began with the detective people. They received a tape, and it told them of the dangerous mission that they were asked to do. The speaker on the tape always said, "Your mission, should you decide to accept it, is this." Of course, the people in the show always accepted the mission that they were given. The Bible is full of stories about people being presented with an impossible mission by God. But I doubt that God prefaced his request with, "Should you decide to accept it." It seems that when God picked someone for his mission, he somehow got his person to accept. Moses was chosen for his mission, and Gideon was chosen for his. And today, we will learn about Nehemiah and the mission that God planned for him. After the reign of King Solomon, the Jewish kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army conquered the northern kingdom and took them to captivity. About 150 years later, the Babylonians destroyed the southern kingdom. The city of Jerusalem was leveled. The temple was demolished, and the city wall was broken down. The Jews were taken captive to Babylon. We may remember that Daniel was one of the boys, the young Jewish boys who was taken to Babylon. After a few years, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and amazingly, the Persian king allowed some of the Jews to return to their homeland. Those who returned built homes for themselves, and they rebuilt the temple. But the city was still broken and burned, and the walls around Jerusalem were still broken down. The Jews had been home about 150 years, and when Nehemiah received a report about how things were going in the homeland. Nehemiah was a Jew working in the palace of the Persian king. He was the king's cupbearer. The cupbearer would bring the king his wine and taste it to make sure that nobody had poisoned it. A king would choose the most loyal, honest, and trustworthy person to be his cupbearer. Nehemiah's job was a prestigious one. The king actually trusted his cupbearer with his life, and he had great confidence in him. So Nehemiah was doing well in his job in the Persian palace. Nehemiah's brother visited Jerusalem, and when he returned, he told Nehemiah that things were not going well in their home city. The wall was torn down, and the gates had been destroyed by fire, and the people were in trouble and disgrace. This news distressed Nehemiah greatly. He sat and he wept, and then he began fasting and praying to God. Nehemiah brooded over this news about Jerusalem for about 4 months, and then he made a plan of action. We can wonder why it took Nehemiah so long to make up his mind about what to do. Maybe he had trouble convincing himself that this was an adventure that he should undertake. After all, he was respected and successful in his life. Why would he leave all that he had and travel 1,000 miles to rebuild a city that was in ruins and work with the people who were in trouble and disgrace? Why would he take a chance on angering the king for whom he worked? That sounds like an impossible mission. But Nehemiah chose to accept it, and he made himself a plan. One day, when he took wine to the king could see that Nehemiah was sad and depressed. Nehemiah told the king that he was upset because his home city, Jerusalem, was in ruins. The king asked Nehemiah, "What is it that you want?" Nehemiah asked for permission to go to Jerusalem and for letters granting him safe passage and a letter allowing him to get timber from the king's forest to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. The king granted Nehemiah's wishes and also gave him an armed escort for the journey. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, he rode a donkey and took a tour of the city, inspecting the broken walls and the gateway entrances. In some places, he and his donkey could not even get through all of the debris. Then Nehemiah met with the city leaders, and he told them about his mission and that the king was willing to help. The citizens immediately wanted to work on this project. Priests, goldsmiths, merchants, rulers, and even women wanted to help to rebuild the wall. Nehemiah organized the workers and assigned groups to work on different sections of the wall, and they began to build. There were non-Jews in the area, and they did not want the Jews to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Bible scholars say that these people thought that if the Jews pulled themselves out of the rubble, that these non-Jews would be kicked out of the area because it was the Jewish land originally. They did not want the Jews to get a stronghold back in their land. A group of these people got together and plotted to stop the work of the building. They accused the Jews of rebelling against Persia. They said the work was sloppy. They threatened to attack the workers. These people decided their only chance to stop the building of the wall was to get rid of Nehemiah. They tried repeatedly to get Nehemiah to leave Jerusalem for talks, but he refused. He did not trust these men, and he would not meet with them. He posted guards day and night to meet the threat of these non-Jews. All through this process, Nehemiah was praying to God for his guidance and protection. The workers began getting frustrated and tired. They had heard the enemy say that they would come in among the workers and kill them. The workers felt that they would definitely be attacked. Nehemiah posted guards with swords and spears and bows. He encouraged the people and reminded them that God was working with them. Half of the workers began guarding the construction. The other half armed themselves and kept working. They did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other hand, and they had swords at their sides. Nehemiah reminded the people, "Our God will fight for us." He would allow nothing to deflect him from his God-given task. The people worked from sunup to sundown. They worked during the day and served as guards during the night. They kept their weapons on them at all times. Amazingly, at the end of 52 days, the Jewish workers finished closing all breaks in the wall and closed the city's gateway entrances with wooden doors. This was such an amazing achievement that even the enemies of the Jews were forced to acknowledge God's hand in the building of the walls around the city of Jerusalem. The Jews gathered to thank God, and Ezra the priest read from the law of Moses. The people were overwhelmed with grief at the extent of their failures, and they agreed to commit themselves to the agreement God made with their ancestors. The Jews promised to follow all the laws written on the sacred scroll, and they began to live by the teachings of Moses. The walls of Jerusalem were in place, and the people had resolved to live by God's law. There was great celebration as the walls of Jerusalem were dedicated. One Bible scholar wrote that the achievements of Nehemiah and Ezra were notable because these were crucial years following the return of Jews from their exile to Babylon. This scholar said that the faith and action of these two leaders caused the Jewish religion and Jewish community to survive. These people returning from Babylon were God's remnant people. It seems that God made his choice of who was to undertake this impossible mission of rebuilding Jerusalem's walls and rebuilding the dedication of the people to following God's law. Rebuilding, putting something back together, making something new, a new beginning. Are there places in our lives where we could benefit from a new beginning? For some, relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, friends and relatives need to be rebuilt. Coaches have to rebuild their teams. Businessmen must rebuild their businesses. And people are forced to rebuild a family after a divorce. Some people must work to rebuild their integrity because of something said or done. Some who have lost loved ones are rebuilding their whole lives. Here at Edgewood, we are in the process of rebuilding our church. We may need to rebuild our personal relationship with God, with Jesus, and with the Holy Spirit. In this changing world that we live in, we can lose sight of some of the good habits that were once valuable to us. Sometimes there may be areas of our lives that just need repair. They're not completely destroyed, but they need attention. My house has places where it needs some rebuilding. The windows need repair and the fascia's falling down. It's easy to leave these to another day, but these things will not get better on their own. If not addressed, they will continue to get worse and worse. We need to be aware of areas of our lives that need attention and keep all in the best working order possible, especially our relationships with God and with other people. Perhaps if we look at Nehemiah's strategy for rebuilding under tough circumstances, we could get some insight into a rebuilding job that we might need to undertake. Nehemiah knew how to get started right. He asked God to help him. That was his first priority. Nehemiah prayed to God constantly as he worked his way through the challenges that he encountered. Then he made an honest evaluation of the situation. In the months before he took action, he planned exactly what he needed and what supplies he needed to gather. Nehemiah took time to carefully formulate his plan of action. When we identify what needs to be rebuilt or repaired in our lives, God will help us to make a plan of action so that we are prepared and confident of the way to achieve our goal. We must ask for God's guidance. When Nehemiah heard the report from Jerusalem, he identified with the need and he took responsibility. He had passion for the people of Jerusalem. He wept and fasted and prayed for them. He personally identified with the need of the Jewish people who had returned to Jerusalem after their exile. Nehemiah could have wept and fasted and prayed and hoped that things would get better. He could have blamed Nebuchadnezzar for conquering his people or the returning Jews for not rebuilding when they first returned from exile. He could have reasoned that Jerusalem was 1,000 miles away and the problem was not his to solve. But Nehemiah decided to take personal responsibility for the situation in Jerusalem. He became focused on building a wall and saving the people of his home country. When we take on our mission, we must be dedicated and care strongly about our task. We must have passion and determination and perseverance for the outcome. And we must take responsibility for the work that we undertake. And finally, Nehemiah put his plan into action, and he achieved his goal. Amazingly, the king granted Nehemiah's request to go to Jerusalem. Amazingly, all of the Jewish people wanted to help build the wall. Amazingly, the wall went up, even with the opposition of the non-Jewish people in the area. Amazingly, the wall was built in just 52 days. Amazingly, the Jewish people turned back to God. Isn't it amazing that when God sends us on a mission, no matter how illogical or how impossible it can seem to us, we seem to maneuver our way through all kinds of obstacles and get God's mission accomplished. As we decide what our mission is in the coming days and weeks, let us dedicate ourselves to our mission. Let us pray to God for his help as we move along, and let us say yes to whatever it is God calls us to do.